Hello and welcome to this first recording in this new series that I'm doing on GNS3 in Azure. So my name is David Okeade. I'm a cloud solution security architect. I'm triple Microsoft MCSE. I'm an AWS solutions architect professional. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, VMware certified professional, and many other certifications that I've completed in the industry. So overall, I'll consider myself a cloud enthusiast. So I'm very much interested in cloud technologies, any of anything that fits into that model, so to speak. So you talk about serverless concepts, you talk about containerization, and you talk about automation, DevOps principles. All that stuff gets me excited. So in this particular recording and the other recordings in this series, what I'll be covering is I'll be showing you how to set up GNS3 lab environment on Azure. And I'll specifically focus on deploying the Sophos network security solutions or Sophos network security appliances in GNS3. Um, and the GNS3 environment that we'll be using will be running it on Microsoft Azure. So for those that may not be aware, GNS3, it's a great application. It's used by hundreds of thousands of network engineers globally to emulate, to configure, to test, and to troubleshoot virtual and real networks. And when I mentioned hundreds of thousands of professionals, that's literally no exaggeration at all. It is a really popular application. So it's something that was originally developed by a guy called Jeremy Grossman. So who originally created the application to help him with his CCNP studies, and it sort of like just exploded from then on. And it's one that's really popular with network engineers, security engineers, and just anything anybody else that has anything to do with networking. So on a personal level for me, GNS3 has really helped me to develop my computer networking skills. It's something that I've used in multiple situations to better understand many networking protocols, to deep dive into them, to understand many networking concepts, especially in my earlier days of IT. So I've built complex and fully automated lab environments based on GNS3 in the past. I still use some of those environments in the role that I do today as I test different things. But sadly, as I've moved around across different roles in my career in IT, I've not had a chance to redesign some of those earlier environments. So much more lately, I've been looking at the latest version of GNS3, and I'm very impressed with what I've seen so far. So, and that leads me into where this series comes in. So, not to keep boring you with the talk, but where this series comes in is I'm getting rid of most of my physical servers that I've used for my testing, and I'm relying more on Microsoft Azure, my Microsoft Azure test environment for my testing. And I thought that it would be a good one to share with you the things that I've learned more recently around setting up your GNS3 lab environment in Azure, um, deploying appliances on them. So I'll be using the Sophos network security appliances to demo that, and then getting internet connectivity to work in this environment. So let's get into the first part of the series. So the first part is we're going to set up GNS3 on Azure. So here are the steps of what I'll be going through today. Number one, ensure that you have sufficient Azure resource quota. So this is very important. So one of the reasons why this is important is because the GNS3 client that you can typically get around with using a machine that's not resource intensive. So something like two CPUs, 8 gig of RAM, standard DS 2v2, something like that will do. But for the GNS3 server, if you could imagine, you'll be running, depending on how complex your lab environment will be, you could be running multiple appliances and powering them on at the same time, which means your GNS3 server has to have enough resources to handle all these workloads. And what that means is you may need to scale in terms of the number of CPUs or the number of RAMs or in terms of the disk and the IOPS that's available to you in terms of your storage. And what that means is a powerful machine on Microsoft Azure. And now, if you're familiar with Microsoft Azure, you know that as it's a shared environment, there are certain default limitations So for example, in the number of CPUs that you could use per region, so which are set by default. If you know that you're going to be selecting a GNS3 server combined with your client and you're going to go over those default limits, you need to reach out to Microsoft and raise a support case to request for more CPU quotas, so to speak. So you'll be able to deploy the VM size that you need to deploy. But in this case, I'll use one that fits into my own current the limitations of my Azure subscription, so as not to go beyond that. But if you're going to be using something more powerful for your proper test environment, you may need to reach out to Microsoft. Just be aware of that um, in case that comes up. So let's move to the next step, which is let's deploy a Windows machine in Azure. And this Windows machine that we'll be deploying is what we'll be using as a GNS3 client. So you see in my lovely diagram over here, I have I have a single Azure virtual network, and I'll be using a single subnet, which is why I've not separated out the subnets. But here you can see I have my GNS3 client. This will be a Windows client, hence the Windows logo. I'll have the GNS3 client installed on this, and I will be connecting to the server, which will be the one that will actually be running my lab environment, but I'll be able to control from the client over here. The client that I'll be deploying will have a public IP address so that I can connect to it via HowDP and can get access to it. It's going to have a network security group that's only going to allow HowDP inbound. So every other port will be blocked apart from HowDP inbound. So that's where I'm going to start. So let's get on with that. So what I'll do is I'll bring up my Azure portal. And in my Azure portal, I'll go on the create a resource. And in this new window, I'll select Windows Server 2016 VM. And then let's go ahead and give it a name. So the name that I'll call it GNS3 client. To keep it simple, I'll give it a username and I'll give it a password. I'll put it in a resource group, which I'll call GNS3-HG for resource group. And I'll select a location. So in this case, I'll leave it as West Europe. I do have a Microsoft license, so I'll go ahead and save some money. And then I have to select my VM size. Now for the client, in terms of what you need to look for in selecting the right size for your GNS3 client, remember that this is not going to be running a lot of workload. It's just going to be running the clients that would be connecting to the server where the workload is running. The main thing that you need to consider here is select something that's price efficient. So for example, D2SV3, 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM. So that's £66 per month. Not that I'll keep it running 24/7. So, but that seems to be a good fit. It's better if it has an SSD, which is the S, because then you get a better performance. One of the things I don't like with my test environment is for a test environment to be very slow, because that can discourage you from testing and from learning. So I typically like it to have good enough performance. So in this case, I'll select this. The other thing that you want to that may also be beneficial if you select a VM size that supports accelerated networking, because it's going to be connecting to this server even though they're on the same virtual network. It's good if it has accelerated networking, then you get access to better network performance. So on the screen for the settings, I'll leave almost everything at the default. I'll just modify a few names. So change that from GNS3 HG VNet to GNS3 VNet. I'll say this is 10.10.1.0/24, just one VNet, one subnet. So I'll change the subnet name to GNS3 VNet subnet 1. And I'll use the entire space also for that subnet. So that's 10.10.1.0/24. And I click OK to that. And that's my VNet and my subnet. For the public IP, I will just make a bit of modifications and change that from GNS3 client IP to put GNS client PIP, just so you know it's a public IP. And I click OK to that. terms of network security group, this is where what we talked about. I'll go ahead and select just RDP. I'll leave no extensions, auto shuts down. Probably good to switch that on, but I'll leave it off for now. Monitoring I don't need because this is a test environment, so it can save some money. Disable monitoring just for me. And I'll go ahead and click OK to that. So that will run through the validation. Validation is passed. I go ahead and click create. And now I'm deploying a Windows virtual machine in Azure that I can use as my GNS3 client. So while that's deploying, let's move over to the next step. Next step is to deploy an Ubuntu server, which you can see here, hence the Ubuntu logo here. And this Ubuntu server, it will be used as my GNS3 server on Azure. So I'm going to deploy that. So one of the reasons, just to let you know here, is you might be considering, why don't I have a single powerful machine on Azure and then use something like nested virtualization to install something like VMware Workstation? Just so you know, that's not going to work. If you try to use VMware Workstation on a virtual machine in Azure so that you can run your GNS3 virtual machine on that, that's not going to work. You're going to get error messages because VMware Workstation is not supported even on a nested virtualization capable machine in Azure. You might be thinking, I'll use VirtualBox, just have a single powerful VM rather than having two separate, one client, one server. Just have one single powerful VM, run VirtualBox on that. Now you can use VirtualBox even though it's not supported, but you will run into error messages also. So you will also encounter performance issues because VirtualBox, except I'm missing something, does not currently support nested virtualization. So that's not the ideal scenario that you want, which is why I'm separating them out to have the client separately and the server separately. Server will be using Ubuntu machine. Now, there are different Ubuntu machine versions on Azure. My recommendation is to use the 16.04 LTS. If you use the latest version, which I think is 18.08, you'll run into error messages when we get to step number 5. So best to just use this 16.04. So if I go back to my Azure environment and I go to create a resource, I'll search for Ubuntu here and I'll press enter. Comes up with this and I select the Ubuntu server 16.04 LTS. So again, we'll keep this relatively simple. Click on create. I'll call the name GNS3 server. So simple name GNS3-server. Give it a username, a password, and I'll leave this disabled. For the resource group, I'll select the existing resource group that I created earlier, which is my GNS3 RG, and I'll leave the location as West Europe. I'll click OK to that. So in terms of the VM size for the server, obviously you need to select something that's powerful. So because again, all the resources, depending on how complex your lab environment will be, whatever server size that you select must be able to handle as many appliances that you're going to be switching on at the same time in your lab environment. In my own case, I'll select the D8S. So if I scroll down, or actually just to make it more simple for myself, I will change the CPU to 8. So only show me anything that has 8 CPUs upwards. So I'll go ahead and select the D8S V3. So the other part that also helps it has an SSD, which means again better performance in terms of storage. So I'll go ahead and select that. And this also supports accelerated networking. Go ahead and click OK to that. In terms of the OS disk size, I'll go ahead and modify that to 512 gig because 30 gig probably won't be enough for the amount of appliances that I expect to run for my lab environment. So be wary of that you may need to resize your OS disk size to something much bigger, which also means better performance. Virtual network, it's already automatically detected the network that I deployed the client into, which is good, and it's detected as subnet. For the public IP address, I'll go ahead and set that to none because I don't want this machine to be available out on the internet, especially since communication between GNS3 and the client and the server goes via HTTP by default, which again, I just don't want that exposed out to the internet. For me to be able to get to my server, I only want the client. So I have to connect to my client, and then from the client, I can connect to the server. But I don't want this to have a public IP, hence reachable from the internet. I don't want that at all. So hence public IP set to none. In terms of network security group, I'll go ahead and select advanced here, and you see the reason why. The reason why I'm selecting advanced is I want to set it to none. I could, if I want to follow the real principles of security, I could have a network security groups that allow the ports that needed for communication between the client and the server. But again, I'm just showing you how to do something quickly. So I'll leave this with no network security group. By the way, the default port that GNS3 server uses is 3080 in case you want to add the network security group. So accelerated networking, I'll enable that. That's a good one. I'll leave everything else as the default apart from monitoring, which I'll disable. And I'll go ahead and click OK to this. It's going to run the validation. It's passed. I'll click create on this. And then that's going to create that for me. So essentially, this is what I have now. So I have a GNS3 client, which I think I use the standard D2S v3, and I have my GNS3 server that I've used the standard D8S v3. The other reason for selecting the v3 versions, by the way, there's a good reason for it also. It's because v3 that support nested virtualization, and that's very important for what we are doing. Because I'll be running vendor images like the Sophos appliance images. So this appliance is run as nested devices on QEMU on Linux. So it's best to use the VM sizes um, that have nested virtualization support. So that's one of the reasons. So if I want good performance, because it's going to be running as nested virtualization, that's why one of the good reasons to select the V3. So that may take a while to complete. So once that's fully, actually, you know what? I think I can move on now because the client is fully deployed. The server is currently being deployed. I can move to step number 4, which is to download and install the GNS3 client on um, on my machine here. So if I go to my Azure portal, and on my Azure portal, if I go on the virtual machines here, and I have my GNS3 client here, the status is shown as running. So if I click on that, I have my public IP address. I can copy that public IP address, and I can bring up remote desktop connection. So let's copy that. I'll bring up remote desktop connection, and I'll click on connect. So it's going to prompt me to log in with my username and password. So I'll go ahead and set that. And I'll go ahead and click on OK. So that's currently connecting me in now, which is good. So after connecting to this machine, a few quick things that I want to do is number one, I'll disable the Internet Explorer and non-security configuration setting. So because that's enabled by default on the Windows Server machine. But I will be browsing the web from this machine because I'll be using it as my GNS3 client. So hence why I will disable that setting. So just give it a few seconds and Server Manager should start up now. So once Server Manager starts up, I'll go ahead and do that. So in order to save some time, I'll just pause this recording. Once Server Manager is up, I'll resume the recording. And welcome back. So Server Manager is up now. So if I go ahead and click on local server, I have the setting for Internet Explorer and non-security configuration here. It should be on, so I'll go ahead and switch that off, and I'll click OK to that. So the next thing that I'll do is I'll bring up Internet Explorer and I'll download two things. Number one application that I'll download is something called Putty. So I'll just search for Putty download. So Putty has an SSH client included with it. So if I go ahead and click on download Putty and click on download here, I can click on the 64-bit version, the MSI installer, and I'll click on run. So because I need the SSH client to be able to connect to my GNS3 server to be able to do certain tasks. So I'll add a shortcut to the desktop. I'll click install, and it finished installing. So if I scroll here, I have Putty there, and I can click on Putty, and I have the client there. So I'll pin this to the taskbar because I'll need this later. The other thing that I want to do is I want to download GNS3 so that I can install the client on this machine. So I can go to gns3.com, and that goes ahead and opens the GNS3 website. I have the free download button here, so I can click on free download. I can either register, but I already have an account, so I'll log in with my account. So I'm logged in with my account. I have the Windows version here, so I'll go ahead and click on download, and that should give me the option to download. I'll go ahead and click on save, and it's already started the download of GNS3, as you can see from this bar here. Once that's finished, I can go ahead and execute the installer and begin the installation of GNS3 on this Windows Server machine, which will be my GNS3 client. So no store password. So that's already downloaded. I'll go ahead and click on run, and it's going to bring up the window that I can begin the installation process. For this, I'll just click on next, and I'll agree, and I'll click on next here. I'll leave everything at the default here. I'll untick SolarWinds response time viewer in order not to make things much quicker. I'll go ahead and click next, and I'll go ahead and click install. So that's going to begin the installation process. There's a lot of stuff that's going to do. It's going to prompt you to install other components, like other applications, like Wireshark. It's going to install the WinPcap for packet captures. So it's going to do all those installation, and it's going to prompt you as it goes on. So let's see how quickly that completes. And it comes up with this. I click next to install WinPcap. I agree, and I leave the option to automatically start the driver at both time, and I click install. So that finished WinPcap installation is going to download Wireshark and install Wireshark on the machine. So we should not take too long. So once this is completed, this whole process, I'll have the GNS3 client installed on this machine. So while it's going through that process, I can move on to the next step, which is install the GNS3 client is what we just did. So the next thing I want to do is I want to install the GNS3 server. In order for me to do that, I already downloaded Putty on the client, so I'll use Putty to connect to the server. Remember that I cannot access the server from the internet, so I need to access it from the HowDP sessions that I have to the client here. So I use Putty to connect via SSH to the GNS3 server, and then I'll run the command to install the GNS3 server component on that. So let's bring up our DP again. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and bring up Putty. I do need the IP address of my server, the private IP address, so I'll quickly get that from the Azure portal. So on the Azure portal, if I click on GNS3 server under virtual machines, under networking, and I should be able to see the private IP there, which is 10.10.1.5. So if I go back there and I put in 10.10.1.5, I'll just make some quick adjustment to make this more visible for you. So I'll change that to 16. I'll make it bold. Click OK. And if I click open now, it's going to try to connect to my server. I have a few things going on at the same time, so I'll just drag that to the side. It's coming up saying the key. I'll go ahead and say yes. And login is the username that I specified when I deployed the Ubuntu machine on Azure. So I'll go ahead and put in my login username, and then it's going to ask me for the password that I put in, which I'll type here. And then I can specify, I can use sudo su to gain the privileges as root, and then I'll run the command to install the GNS3 server on this machine. So by the way, all this information will be on the blog, azurehangouts.com. So I'll post the commands that I'm using here and the steps that I'm following here. I'll post them to that. So first of all, I go to cd /temp, and then I run this command to install the GNS3 or to download the GNS3 installer script, GNS3 server installer script. So GNS3 remote install. So that's the GitHub path where that's located. So I'll go ahead and click on that, and that's downloaded that. If I click on list, if I do, yeah, and I can see I have GNS3 remote install.sh there. So the next thing that I need to do is I need to run that script, that installer script with certain switches. So for example, I'm running this script and I specify with IOU with i386 repository. So with IOU means it's going to install IOU support for the machine. IOU is just a way to run another way of running Cisco IOS in case you're interested in practicing that. But you have to ensure that you have the right licenses, obviously, to use that. With i386 repository, so that's going to be required by IOU at this time. So that's why I'm specifying that. There are other options that we could use. I'll point you to the URL. So things like with OpenVPN. But I don't need to use that because I'm not making this available on the internet. This is something within the private virtual network in Azure that I'm connecting to from my client. So if I go ahead and press enter to run that, it's going to begin the installation of the GNS3 server. It's going to download all the components that it needs to do that. So we'll just pause the recording and wait for that to finish. In the meantime, the client is successfully installed. If I go ahead and click next, I have the option to download some free SolarWinds standard toolsets, which are great, but for the sake of this demo, I'll just click no to that. And I'll leave this option selected to start GNS3. And I won't click finish. What I'll do is I will pause the recording, wait for the server to complete installation, and then I'll show you how to connect. First of all, how to verify that the server is installed successfully, and then how to connect from the client to the server. So I'll see you in a few minutes once this is completed. And welcome back. So the GNS3 server has successfully installed. You can see that from this message that it has at the end of the whole process, the GNS3 installed with success. Now, if I want to verify that, the easiest way to use to verify, if I do ifconfig, it's 0 on this. That's the IP address of private IP address of my GNS3 server. I should be able to connect to this private IP on port 3080 using HTTP. So, which is what I'll try to do now. So if I type in HTTP 10.10.1.5 port 3080, enter, that takes me to welcome to GNS3. I can view my controller status there, and which is what I'm connected, which is what I will connect to using the GNS3 client. I can view the compute status there. So it's going to show me the compute utilization there. So Well, that shows that the installation is successful. So the final thing that I'll do is let's go back to a nice diagram and the steps is I'm going to configure the GNS3 client to use the GNS3 server. So let's go back to the LDP session. The GNS3 client successfully installed and I left it at this state intentionally. So I have the option to tick or untick this to start GNS3, which I'll leave that selected and I'll click finish. So that's what's going to automatically launch the GNS3 client for us very soon. Here we go. So I'll just take that away from the background so we don't have all those distracting us. So here's the GNS3 client that is launched. So here's very important what we do here because we have a setup wizard. On the setup wizard, it tells us what we want to do. We want to run modern iOS, which we'll need the GNS3 VM for, which we again is what I told you earlier that this does not work very well on a virtual machine in Azure. So if you try to install a GNS3 VM, you either have to use VMware Workstation, vSphere ESXi, or VirtualBox. If you VirtualBox, there's no nested virtualization support, so you're limited a lot. If you try to use VMware Workstation on an Azure virtual machine, you get an error message because it's going to detect that is running on Hyper-V, and it's not going to work. So essentially, which is why I'm using the option that I'm using, which is using a remote server, albeit on the same virtual network. So I'll select this option where it says advanced usage, run everything on a remote server, and I'll click on next. In case you've already done this and skipped this, if you want to get this wizard up again, you can click on help. You can go set up wizard and it's going to come up with this window and then you can go through this process just in case you've already canceled this. So I'll select run everything on the remote server and I'll click on next. It's going to ask me to specify the IP address of my remote server. In this case, I'll specify the private IP address. Let's go back to our diagram. I'll specify the private IP address of this machine. That's 10.10.1.5. This is 10.10.1.4. So I'm going to be specifying the private IP address of this machine and saying that is the GNS3 server that you'll be using. So that's where I'll be running everything that we need to run on. So that's what I'll go back to do now. So I'll specify 10.10.1.5. The default port which you connected to via the web is 3080. I'll leave that. There's no authentication by default, so I'll leave that disabled also, and I'll click on next. And once I've done that, you may not have seen it, but over here, it shows that it's connected to the server and it's already beginning to show me the utilization on the server there. So if I go ahead and click finish, that's it. Essentially, I have my GNS3 client in Azure, running in Azure, connecting to my GNS3 server running in Azure. And then now I can begin to set up my lab environment. So this is where I'll stop with this particular recording. In the next recording in this series, I'll show you how we can begin to add an appliance template file. Specifically, I'll be demonstrating this using how to add the Sophos XG firewall and the Sophos UTM to GNS3 so that we can create a lab environment here. So thanks very much for watching this video. I hope that you found it helpful and useful. As I mentioned, the steps that I covered, I'll put it in the blog azurehangout.com and then you'll be able to find the steps there. But I also put some links in the description of this video below for you to make it much more easier. But then in the next recording, we'll go through that whole process. So see you in the next recording. Bye for now.